Welcome to the 5 a.m. podcast, where we bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders and influencers who are making headway and some waves in their callings. Today, we are pleased to have a guest who is a beacon of hope for survivors of domestic violence and a powerful advocate for personal growth. Stacey Womack is the founder and executive director of Abuse Recovery Ministry and Services, known as ARMS, and she has dedicated over 25 years to transforming lives and communities. Stacey's work has earned her numerous accolades, including the 2012 Judge Harrell Award for Outstanding Collaborative Effort to End Family Violence. Her expertise has been sought after on various platforms, from co-chairing family violence coordinating councils and joining podcasts like this one to tackle this complex issue surrounding domestic abuse. Today, we will delve into our guest's journey to explore the critical work of ARMS and discuss how we can all play a part in breaking the cycle of abuse. Now, before we roll that intro, please share this with your friends and networks. I know many of you are going to enjoy this conversation and find it helpful and fruitful. Two other things that you can do, if you can be so kind, is to give 5 a.m. Podcast a 5-star review on your favorite podcast player. And a special thanks to those who have purchased coffees at buymeacoffee.com/5am podcast. If you want to join those grateful groups of people, head over there and we will appreciate your support. Now, let's roll that intro. Stacey Womack, welcome to the 5 a.m. podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. So let's hop in a time machine. And can you take us back to 1997 and share what inspired you to found ARMS? And maybe was there a specific moment or experience that drove you to take action?
I think that's probably what makes my story a little bit more unique than some. I kind of have to step a little bit further back.
Sure.
Just to give you a little background, I was raised in the church. My father was a pastor. So I was raised in and around ministry. I met my husband young. We got married young. We have 6 children and our 13th grandchild on the way.
Wonderful.
And I was homeschooling them, my kids, back in the day when it was kind of a new thing. And in the midst of that, which was really my ministry at the time, God began to speak to me about ministry beyond my family. And so I spent a couple of years seeking God for what he had me to do. And lo and behold, this was the door he opened. And I stepped through it really not knowing any more than the average person knows about abuse, which was very confusing to me. I thought maybe I'd be doing something I would know something about, or at least something happy. And my goal at the time was really just to lead a couple groups of women through their healing process once I figured out how to do that. But it was God's idea to then move into incorporating, and we had our nonprofit status. That happened in 1999. And from there, we were just quadrupling in size and learning how to train other volunteer leaders that wanted to do the same thing that we do. And it's just grown from there. So now that we're in 7 countries and have our women's recovery materials translated into 5 different languages. We're working on our 6th right now.
Right. So this just isn't a North American issue. This is
No,
that it spans the globe.
it does.
And are there commonalities in maybe the touch points or the start buttons, let's say, of this happening in relationships, or does it really run the gamut as to why behind the abuse?
I believe it really is a equal opportunity offender. I mean, another way you could say it's just sin. I mean, it's someone who is misusing power and control to gain what they want in a relationship and abusing that in a way that's hurtful and harmful to the other person, whether it's emotionally, financially, spiritually, property. And we talked about abuse in 8 different forms. So what we've learned over working in this field for so long, and not just with women who have experienced abuse, but also working with men and women who've used abuse behaviors, is that for our men, most of the men have grown up in homes where some level of abuse was happening. And for the few who did not, they learned that bullying worked for them at a young age. And so if you do it long enough, it becomes a pattern and it becomes a way of functioning and adjusting your needs to meet, try to meet your needs through power control, which obviously isn't healthy. It's very damaging to relationships. And so we not only work with those who have experienced it, but we also work with those who use it. And so it gives us a really broad view and understanding of this issue.
Yeah, almost like you'd be able to almost have a parenting course then to
We
say,
have done that in the
yeah,
past.
yeah,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about, you might nip something in the bud between a husband and wife, but then to break that cycle, can you talk a little bit about that in raising
Yeah.
up children?
Absolutely. I believe that it is a generational thing. And I think so if we can help the parents, and not that we shouldn't have children's programs, but children are pretty powerless to do
Yeah,
anything. So, but if we can help at least one of the two parents to get healthy and to learn how to have some tools that are healthy, we can actually break the cycle for the next generation. It's always better when we can have both parents working on that, both of
yeah,
them working to be healthy. I think that what we're seeing nowadays is less and less even just normal, healthy parenting skills. But unfortunately, parent control is really about being selfish and self-focused, and we're all a little bit of that. But this is someone who's using abuse, is using a pattern of behaviors that's, like I said, very damaging, whether it's verbally or emotionally or physically or financially, however that may look. And it's the number one cause of injury to women in the world. Yet most abuse is not physical. Most abuse is emotional. And a lot of people underestimate how important emotional health and emotional safety in a relationship is. They only think about physical safety, but our women would say, the over 50,000 that we serve would say, Stacey, the physical abuse was scary, but the emotional abuse leaves the lasting damage. And at least with the physical abuse, people will recognize it as abuse. But when they try to share emotional abuse, it sounds like normal marriage conflict, but it's really not. They really are two different things, even though they have some things that look similar.
so there's that old saying that probably we've all heard it for a long time: if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Does that kind of fit with that emotional component?
No, I wouldn't say in abusive relationships that statement is probably the best one. I don't think any woman signs up for this. I think that when they get married, they're hoping for the
Of course.
happy mutual relationship, teamwork. We're going to work together as a team. We're going to raise our family as a team. They want that. That's why so many women don't leave those relationships. Or if they do, they go back multiple times because nobody gets into a relationship to see it end. So, and as a woman of faith, they'll try everything. Counseling is probably the most common thing, but couples counseling doesn't work in these relationships. I have women who've tried as many as 15 counselors to do couples counseling. And really they need to work on these issues separately. Fortunately for the person who's being abusive, whether they're male or female, they don't think they have a problem. And so they're not willing to seek help. So usually there has to be an external pressure, whether that's community corrections or Department of Human Services or their partner saying, if our relationship has any chance to make it, you need to go to this program and get the help and make changes so that we can have a happy relationships. Now they both have their own work to do, but the person who's using abuse has even more work to do. And it takes a long time. It's a lot of hard work. It's hard to face yourself when we all feel bad about the bad choices that we made, how it's negatively impacted people. So when we're working with, especially with our men, I know they feel really horrible at first when they're attending our groups because we're making them look at it on a regular
Right.
basis. But as they get into the program and they begin to realize how helpful it is, and as they put into practice the things that we're teaching them, it's pretty amazing to watch the change.
Right. Yeah, it sounds to me like this comes down in a lot of cases of learned behaviors, and then people don't actually have the tools
Yeah.
to build the relationship. Were there some other surprises or things that came to you over these past 25 years or more that you've been doing this, that you were like, wow, I did not see that coming, but yet it's a valuable tool?
Absolutely. I guess that one thing I didn't, when I first started, in just my church, I
Of course.
started just kind of reaching out to my church and holding a small group, that type of thing. And I was so shocked by how many women came up to me privately for years, and that we were in a pretty good sized church, telling me this is what they were experiencing at home. And they looked like the perfect family. They were involved in the church. You would never have known. You never would have thought of it. I kept telling myself, stop being so surprised. And yet I think that culturally, especially for men, women use abuse too. And there are male victims out there. So I want to acknowledge that. But it tends to work better for men because the way men are socialized and the way, the power that's given to them by society and even by the church, that kind of, and the fact that you're bigger and stronger than women tends to just work better.
Yeah.
That I think that just a lot of those, a lot of times we just see that. And yet these guys look so great on the surface, and they're involved, and they're on church councils, and they're running rotaries, and everybody thinks they're just the nicest guy, but they don't see what's going on at home.
Yeah, that's for sure. And
Yeah.
that's those walls are put up to protect abusers and to those learned behaviors. How do you then begin to break down those walls and maybe bring light into the darkness?
So for the women, actually we teach this in all our groups, but for the women who have experienced abuse, is that we really want them to go from knowing from kind of a head place that they have value and that they're loved, to believing it with their heart, and that to help them to understand that God never intended for abuse to be a part of any relationship, that he doesn't condone it. The words in the Bible you'd see around this would be oppression. Abuse is another way for saying someone's being oppressed. And he's not okay with that. And so I think that for them, to help them to see that they have value and begin to believe that, because then they make different choices. They start setting boundaries. They start trying new things, start reaching for their dreams. For the men, we also want them to move. Again, a lot of them have kind of a basic knowledge that God loves them. But again, we also want them to move it from head to heart knowledge as well. But with the men, we're really working on belief systems that they hold that give them permission to behave in that way. So I'm the boss. I'm right. You're wrong. You're attacking me. I need to teach you a lesson. These are really simple beliefs that are held that then justify their use of abusive behaviors. And so during our groups, that's what we're really working on, is the roots, not just the behaviors, because if all you do is change the behaviors, it's like pulling the top off of a weed. And a dandelion takes about a week to grow back. So, we want to get to the root system so that it doesn't just change while they're in the program, but it can be sustained once they are out of the program. And so we have a real heart and a real passion for that.
Yeah. And you had mentioned the word love. And of course, it's such a used word in music and movies and all of those things. And that mind renewal that people need to have around words. And I suppose also too, there's a Bible verse that says, be sure your sins will find you out.
Yes.
And that's kind of connected to the fear of God and understanding what that word fear actually means.
Right.
Can you talk about maybe some of the success stories you've had in seeing this mind renewal as people are transformed from an old pattern to a new pattern of behavior?
We have so many, we hear from our women so often. I remember I had a woman in my group, and she had two friends who were bringing her. She was so broken down. She looked like she was dying. I mean, she was so thin and so pale, and she wouldn't even give a prayer request in the class, which is, we don't ask our women to share if they don't want to. And these friends took turns bringing her because they were coming from a little bit of a distance. And after about 6 months, she started driving herself, which is a really big deal.
Wow, that's huge.
And she eventually, a situation happened with her husband, and they'd been married for quite some time. And he had pushed her, and she fell and it broke her tailbone. And he taunted her that she'd never call the police. And she did. And the police were friends with him though. So they stood in the garage talking about just whatever.
Right.
And then he says, well, you need to leave for the night. Then they arrest him. But she had the strength to go down and get a restraining order, a protection order, it's called, depending on what state you're in. And it was messy for a while, but I saw her years later. She came into the office, and I hadn't seen her like in 2 years, and I didn't even recognize her. I mean, I walked right past her. She came in to do some volunteer work for us. I didn't recognize her. She was like completely like so transformed. It was just amazing. And we've had women go on to become counselors, nurses, district attorney, victim advocacy aides. I mean, we have all kinds of these stories of these women who've just got to such a healthy place. And even with our men, you got kind of like everybody wants to know how successful are you, what's your success rate? And, there's kind of a continuum. So on one end, you have a group of guys who make very little change and usually don't stay in the program more than a few weeks. And then you have the guys on the other side who work very hard and seek accountability on multiple sides. They're going to counseling for their childhood trauma. They're being mentored by their pastor, and they're coming to group. And those guys make great changes, and the relationships are often saved and healthy, but it takes a very long time for it to be sustained, right? And for it to be safe for the victim again, who's given her heart away multiple times already.
Yeah.
And then you have everybody in between, right? So you've got all these guys who decide that they'll change this much, but they don't
Right.
agree with us on this. So this is as far as they go. And still the women share that at least, even if the relationship didn't make it, at least the co-parenting is going well. They're not using the children as pawns anymore, which is a great thing for the kids, right? Which also would help break that cycle of abuse. So, it's exciting. And, to walk alongside people in their process of change. And I guess some of the moments that stand out to me are I remember at a banquet, I had a gentleman share. He was a little bit of a loose cannon, a little worried about him sharing at our banquet. But everybody loved him because he was so honest. But at one point, he turned and looked at me and he said, "Thank you." And I knew he meant it from the top of his head to the tips of his toes, as his gratefulness for going through this program that he stayed in it for a long time.
Yeah.
And now is in a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
And
That's good.
yeah, so it's been exciting.
Yeah. A lot of people bring a lot of trauma and baggage and other things like that. And sometimes, when two young people come together and they don't know all the damage that's been done in those years up to that point, there needs to be that change in mindset, but also in relationship, because in my mind, they're just not, maybe they're just the person used to bring the other one to the next level of whatever that may be. But I wanted to switch gears just a little bit, because if you're like me, or if our viewers are kind of like in this household, we've been watching a lot of YouTube and independent media and things like that. And we've been seeing a lot of disclosure in church relationships and those people in positions of authority. And I am sure that it's been shocking to a lot of people. I was told once a long time ago, never trust the man that speaks from a stage. And I think that's valuable advice. But why do you think that there has been, 2025, end of 24, seems to be a lot of disclosure coming out about people that they may not have expected? They've seen these popular people. And now
Sure.
you're hearing, can you talk into that at all?
Yeah, I think I can, in the sense that I think people tend to put like pastors and clergy on a pedestal, in a sense. I watched that with my own dad. I always thought that was weird because I knew my dad with messy hair and, stinky clothes, and, he was just a guy.
Yeah.
Yet, and yet they do have a high responsibility when they're up front. And I would say that I probably wouldn't agree with don't ever trust somebody who speaks from a platform.
Yeah, right.
But the reality is you don't trust everybody who speaks from a platform.
Yeah.
There's some you can, some you can't, right? So,
Right.
But domestic abuse is an equal opportunity offender. And since we're all raised in the same broken world, pastors are also going to have some of the same issues, whether it's pornography addiction or abuse or alcohol and drug addiction or whatever it may be. They're all, and they have a heart to serve, but they have these issues, and church should be a place where we can be open and honest about that. And if they come forward and say, "Hey, this is a problem for me," they should be honest and humble and step away until they can get to a healthy point before they're able to come back and be in that position again. If they ever get to that point where they can be accountable enough to do that. Because God wants to use it. If he's called us, even in all our brokenness and all our mess, he still chooses to use us.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't mean that we don't need to work on stuff, right? So I just think that, I think the faith community can be really harsh to its leaders. And I think that while there's consequences to sinful choices that people have made, I also believe that there's the ability to help people seek the help they need so they can find the wholeness that God intended for them in the first place. I believe that every person that comes into our program is because God has specifically brought them to us. And I know someone's praying for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's great. So let's talk about your book. I know you have it beside you. So if you could hold it up for our viewers, what was your process that brought you to the point of knowing that you had to write a book about this?
I've been asked that question before. I do a lot of trainings nationally, and I've never really felt the need to write a book, but it was just time for someone to have tools, an easy tool in their hands. So it's called On the Front Lines of Abuse, Strategies for the Faith Community. It's really for the entire faith community. So whether it's somebody like me who wasn't raised around that, didn't see it, didn't experience it, it's helpful to them. It's helpful for people who've experienced abuse, which is a lot, 1 in 3 women. And for those who've used abuse, I tell them what they can do. And for women who've used abuse, what they can do. And then what church leaders and pastors can do. And pastors love it because it's just a little book.
Yeah.
And they say, this is perfect, because they're given books all the time. And I had one pastor go, Stacey, this is so perfect because I don't have the time to read all those other books, and I had some ideas around abuse, but this gave me so much more. And for those who survived abuse, they've said to me, Stacey, this brought a whole new level of healing to me because it affirms their experience as we talk about all the different forms of abuse. Yeah.
Yeah, it is good to lay everything out. And you used an interesting term of the word use abuse, so that there are those men and women in relationships who it sounds like you're saying they actually use abuse as a tool to get what they need out of life. What are a couple of practical steps where I guess people have to be self-aware enough to say, I'm using this as a tool to get what I want? But are there a couple of maybe signposts or triggers along the way where someone could say, oh, I've been using that as a tool in my relationship?
I think that on our website, abuserecovery.org, we have a kind of a quiz on how, if you can determine whether or not you're in an abusive relationship. But I've also had people who use abuse read through it and go, I've done that. Oh, I've done that too. Oh, I've done that too. And it helps them to become more self-aware. Very few of our participants come because they figure it out on their own, though.
Gotcha.
So
that makes sense.
Yeah. So, for the women who are watching who have experienced abuse or are currently in abuse, we have a free program that they can start today. So if we don't have something locally in their area, we have virtual options, and almost every single day of the week except for Sunday right now. They can join right away. And we're always looking for new leaders to train. And we're planning on opening a national Zoom group for our men as well in the next, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months, I'm hoping. So it's not as good as in person. I prefer to do it in person. We've done it via Zoom. But we have really great outcomes nationally. Men who go through a program like this, who are arrested for abuse, who complete a program, have a 50% recidivism rate, meaning they'll get rearrested within the first 5 years. But we've been having the courts at the county check for us. And since 2011, we've been running at a 5% or less recidivism level. So God is in the work that we do.
Yeah.
But I just want to say that our women's group is so trauma informed. It's so safe. The women don't have to give us their real name. There's no intake. They just come. And again, it's free, and they can start at any time. They don't have to wait to the beginning of it. They can just come. We just want to serve them.
Yeah. That's wonderful. And I just wanted to ask you this then. How do you maybe approach that delicate balance between promoting forgiveness and healing while ensuring that survivors prioritize their own personal well-being?
Absolutely. We talk a lot about boundaries. And, just because you have a boundary, like even if the boundary is geographic, you're not living in the same home.
Right.
Doesn't mean that you can't still work through forgiveness, because forgiveness really isn't about the other person. It's about you personally. So we have a whole lesson in our women's program that talks about what forgiveness is not, and then how the process of working through that forgiveness. It's not a light switch that you can just say, oh, I forgive, and you're over it.
Right.
You have to work through the process. So, but that doesn't mean you don't have boundaries. God still loves us, even though he sets boundaries, and even oftentimes has us suffer the consequences of our choices, right? Because he loves us and helps us to grow as people. He's also merciful, But God is very balanced between that mercy and that judgment, or mercy and accountability. It's very balanced. And I think for a lot of women who've experienced abuse, we've learned and been taught by the church to extend mercy without the accountability. And that's where I think that needs to change.
Yeah. So is there some advice as we're getting close to wrapping this up? What advice would you maybe give to someone who suspects a friend or a family member is either using abuse as a tool or the victim of in an abusive relationship?
You probably can't say much to the person who's using abuse, because if they get upset at you for sharing it, they're likely to take it out on their victim. They won't take it out on you. They'll take it out on the victim. So unless she is separated, like actual physical separations, which are very valuable in these types of relationships for safety reasons, and also an opportunity for them to get their focus off of one another. But for those who have family members, and I have family members who've gone through abuse, close family members, all you can do is number one, pray for them. Number two, when you have the opportunity to privately tell them, do you know that behavior is abusive? And they may not like that, and they may get very upset that you said that, but you have planted a seed. Or you might invite them to come to a group with them. So our women can bring a support person with them. It's like, would you come? Would you be willing to sit in this group and just hear about it? Or go on this website and take this kind of quiz that we have on how healthy is your relationship? Just to help them begin that exploration, because again, most women who are experiencing abuse would never say they're victims of abuse. They would never use those words unless they were in a program like ours. Perpetrators, though, always call themselves victims.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's like yeah.
I know it's crazy. And our male and female perpetrators, primary aggressors, those ones who are using power and control, and gaining power and control of their relationships, they talk and do very similar things. Male and female victims also say and do very similar things. So, when men call and say, hey, this is what I've experienced, I don't decide right then and there whether they're telling me the truth or not. But there are sometimes the way they come at me tells me whether or not this is really the truth. And we then refer them out to one-on-one counseling with counselors that we know who have been specifically trained in domestic violence, because there's not many. Michael, there's only like 9% of counselors are trained in domestic violence. Most counselors only get maybe 2 hours of training in college. Yeah.
That's not good at all.
Yeah, it's not. It should be in every seminary, every social worker, every counseling degree should require 40 hours of victim advocacy training.
Wow. So this might sound off topic, and I know I've got to ask how our listeners can get in touch with you, but have you found at all that diet and food has any impact on how the abusers act or continue on? Have you seen anything, research about that?
Well, I mean, when we talk about, let's take something like drugs and alcohol. Okay. Drugs and alcohol don't cause abuse. They just lowers a person's inhibitions to act on the belief systems that they already hold. Okay. So our men would say, well, I was blacked out. I'm like, okay, I get that. That does happen. Usually there's little bits and pieces I see. And so they'll ask him, how drunk would you have to have sex with your mother? And they're all like, oh, that's gross. And I'm like, so even in a blacked out state, your belief system is so strong that you would never do that. And so that would be the same thing with food. I mean, sure, we might be more likely to, if we're overtired or over hungry, to behave a certain way, but it does not excuse the abuse at all.
Right. Of course. Yeah, absolutely. I was just curious if there's some types of foods or chemicals in modern processed food that might impact a chemical imbalance in the brain or something like that.
This isn't a mental health issue, and I'm sure there's probably some truth to that, but I'm not a physicist and a nutritionist to be able to answer that question. But I'm sure that those, things play into all our lives in some way.
Yeah, no, it is a very broad topic. And as you say, there's so little formal training for counselors or psychologists and even ministers to go through. So how can our listeners who might be inspired by our conversation today, or your work is what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
How can they get in touch with you?
Well, they can go to our website, which is, again, abuserecovery.org, abuserecovery.org. Or they can call us at 503-4692-84. And it's that simple. The book is listed on Amazon, on the front lines of abuse strategies for the faith communities on Amazon. And if you know a family or friend that needs this information, make sure you get it out to them. And we want to help. We want to come alongside, especially the faith community, because our niche is we're doing this all from a Christian perspective. So we want to come alongside them and help them in their journey of being healthy.
Good.
Healthy relationships.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about this important topic.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was a great conversation and an important one to have. And I want to say thanks to our viewers too. We appreciate you joining in on this conversation. And if you haven't already, please help us spread out this message and the other content that we have here at 5am Podcast. Sorry, if you can like it and share it with your friends. I'm sure there's somebody's name that's rolling around in your head that you might have a little bit of intrepidation, but test the waters and send us out to those friends that need to hear this and be an advocate for someone they know that needs to get out of an abusive relationship and see some mindset change in their family. Now, one more thing, as I mentioned at the top of the show, if you can give 5am Podcast a 5-star review on your favorite podcast player. And once again, I would be remiss if I did not thank those who are supporters over at buymeacoffee.com/5am Podcast. You help us keep going, and who doesn't want a cup of coffee? So thank you all for your participation in what we do here at 5am Podcast. Be sure to check out Stacey's website and her book on Amazon. Until next time, make sure to seize your day and enjoy those sunrises and sunsets. I'm Michael Clausen.